Hi everyone. So here we are, 25 years later after the release of Quake. Many of you that are joining here today are probably here because of the Doom content on this YouTube channel. However, Quake actually has been a bigger influence in my gaming life, more so than Doom. I was exposed to Doom first, but Quake, I think, played such an important role, eventually what would become modern day first person shooters. And we may have drifted further away from that with, military shooters of the late 2000s, early 2010s, but things have gone full circle. And we're back in the, with the, particularly with the release of the new Wolfenstein games, Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. And what's interesting about those games is that they actually adopt a lot of the design philosophies that were first introduced in Quake. Now, Quake is built on the foundation of the original Doom and Doom 2. So, in celebration of the 25th anniversary of Quake, I want to go through the evolution of the game itself. Unlike Doom, that came out and then it was done. And of course, we do have source ports and stuff like that. The official releases of Doom haven't really changed. Even the recent Unity ports, still try to maintain that same style and look of the original DOS releases back in 1993 and 1994. And this is not the case with Quake. Quake was released during a very, very intense, critical moment in PC gaming when everything was changing. The way that computers would render graphics was changing. The way that people would play first person shooters was changing. And Quake was right in the middle of this change. So we're going to play the single player campaign, but we're not going to go through all the levels in one go. What's actually going to happen is that we're going to revisit some of the levels, but each level is going to represent a different era of PC gaming. So let's start right from the beginning with the release of the original DOS version that came out in June of 1996. Now, some of you might be looking at this video footage and you might be wondering, why is it so pixelated? Can't you play this at a high resolution? Don't worry, we'll play this at a high resolution, but I just want to show you that sometimes our understanding of modern times, in modern times of what it was like being a PC gaming back then, sometimes we don't have a completely accurate understanding of what gaming back then actually really was like. Most people back then didn't have a computer fast enough to run a game at a resolution of 640 by 480. So this was it. This wasn't even 320 by 240. This was 320 by 200, which is the same resolution that Doom ran under. And it took a while to get up on those stairs because that's actually a lot harder than it looks. But yeah, I'm going to be collecting a lot of secrets. I'm not actually going to collect all the secrets. In fact, I'm not even going to 100% these maps. I just want to show the more interesting parts of these maps. But yeah, so back in those days, we had Pentium processors that, they were pretty new back then. They ran at around 60 megahertz, 75, 90 megahertz. Really not very fast. So this really was as good as it could get. Like, if we were to run this game at a high resolution, it would probably run too slow for it to be playable. That is assuming you can run it at a higher resolution, because there was another limitation, and that was your graphics card. If you had a normal VGA graphics card, it could only play games at this lower resolution. They could not play at anything higher than 320 by 240 or something like that. They just didn't have enough video memory. So really, we were very limited. And now sound cards were really, pretty popular, that it almost guaranteed every person that played games had some kind of capable sound card, usually a sound blaster. Unfortunately, sound blasters were pretty good, like pretty much as good as they could get for quite a few years. CD quality sound, particularly music, because the music is being played using actual CDs like the Red Book audio CD. So it was quite a different time back then. It was quite a different time. And even though this game is a sort of, a lot of people refer to it as a Doom clone back in those days, but when I was a kid, I didn't think of it as a Doom clone. It felt so different from Doom. It was a first-person shooter, but man, the physics and the controls, even the weapons, there's some similarities, like you got your shotguns and stuff, but ultimately it felt so different. Okay, so we're done with map 1, and now we're in the second map, and as you can see, I bumped the resolution up to probably the most common resolution that we would play games in the late 90s and early 2000s. Most of us, we didn't actually have, big monitors. Some of the most common size monitors back in those days was anywhere between 14 inches to 17 inches. And 17 inches was considered to be like pretty good. Like that was considered to be like nice gaming PC, monitors type of thing. And that's because we really didn't need anything that big. Computers, again, they didn't run very well at extremely high resolutions like 1024 by 768. And that sounds like not a very high resolution, but back then that was a very, very high resolution. You needed a pretty high-end graphics card to run games at that resolution. So as a result, again, most of us, we just played 640 by 480, and we were quite content with that, because bear in mind, that's the resolution that 6th generation consoles would run at best. So like GameCube, PlayStation 2, most games ran at 480i, and computer games ran on average at 480p. So even that was a little bit better than what consoles had. And that's just because lower resolution graphics just looked a little better on CRTs than they do in LCDs. People look at games nowadays on LCDs and they're like, ugh, I cannot believe people used to play games like this. Well, actually, you play on a CRT and everything just looks richer and crisper, and the low resolution doesn't look so low. It still looks really good, even to this day. If anyone out there has some kind of access to a decent CRT for a monitor, it's worth experimenting with it to see what older games look like on these CRTs. It is quite a different world, and I grew up in that world, but even I forgot what it was like to have even I forgot what stuff looked like on the CRT, because I've been using LCD monitors for such a long time. But I'm very tempted to plug my CRT into my modern gaming PC, but I won't do that, because that thing only has a max resolution of I think it's something like 1280 by 1024, which is still not HD resolution. But that resolution back in the early 2000s, that was a huge resolution. And Quake actually did support that resolution. But, this was back before scaling of sprites and HUDs and stuff like that was any good. As a result, if you made the game's resolution way too high, then the HUD would be so tiny, it would be hard to read your HUD. You might have noticed the size of the HUD had drastically changed from, 200p to 480p. It's a huge, huge difference. So one of the things that, unfortunately, I did not experience a lot when it came to Quake was the multiplayer. By the time I really had a computer capable multiplayer, had networking capabilities and that sort of thing, it was during the Quake 3 days. Now, Quake 3, I spent a long time Quake 3 playing multiplayer, and that was great. And I'm not sure if I would like to go back to Quake 1. I mean, I do enjoy playing Quake 1, definitely. But I think the single player is something special. The multiplayer was extremely popular at the time, but I think the multiplayer is um, kind of archaic compared to modern arena style shooters, particularly the kind of stuff we have nowadays with the things like Quake Champions, for instance. Not saying that Quake's multiplayer isn't very good, because thanks to the modding community, we got a lot of really cool kinds of experiences, such as Team Fortress started life on Quake. You, and a whole bunch of new rules were created, like capture the flag and that sort of thing. Now here we are, we moved over to 3D accelerated mode. Now just to explain how different it was back then, this major shift that I kind of alluded to, and that is the move from software rendering to hardware rendering. Now that might sound a little confusing, because doesn't software and hardware work hand in hand? Yes, but we're referring to a specific kind of process, and that is how the graphics are created. So the CPU would basically do all of the rendering, right? Um, that's why it was so hard for these games to run well, because you didn't have some kind of GPU, you didn't have some kind of graphics processor to help with the processing. The CPU had to do everything. And the CPU really is just a jack of all trades and a master of none. The CPU is designed to do anything and everything, but it doesn't necessarily do one particular thing brilliantly, So, and as a result, you actually have to tell the CPU how to do things like rendering 3D graphics, for instance. And so you basically tell the CPU through software. That's why it's called software rendering, okay? Because it's handled completely through basically, when you write a game engine that uses only the CPU, you're writing everything that the CPU has to do in terms of graphics. Whereas nowadays we have things like DirectX and OpenGL and Vulkan that does much of the work for us and works in conjunction with the GPU. So the GPU does most of the grunt of the work, and you don't have to tell it every single little thing it needs to do. You only need to sort of point it in the right direction, and then the GPU will know exactly what it needs to do. So that's hardware rendering. Now, what you're seeing right now is the first examples of hardware rendering. Now, Quake did not come with hardware rendering capabilities when it first came out in 1996, and that makes sense, because 3D acceleration, even though technically it did exist through graphics processors and that sort of thing, it wasn't really it wasn't something that your average gamer had access to, until I would say that even though there were some attempts at bringing it to the gaming market, bringing this amazing hardware to the gaming market, it was so incredibly expensive. But when you align the stars together, when you market it right, when you have a nice balance between power and pricing, you end up with what 3DFX ended up with. 3DFX, a company that created graphics cards back in the 90s, and their flagship series was called the Voodoo line of graphics cards. And the Voodoo one, which came out, some people say it came out in 96, but the reality is that I think that most people only had access to it in 1997. So that's like an entire year after the release of Quake. So Carmack at the time, John Carmack, the programmer of this game engine, he believed that just through software trickery we can do amazing things. And he's right. At the time he was right, because Quake was amazing for its time, and Doom was amazing for its time, and Wolfenstein 3D and all of these other games they made. But things were changing now. Now technology was going to ramp up drastically. So we had just taken a look at 640 by 480, 3DFX Voodoo sort of quality graphics. But here, we're taking a look at how a modern PC can, well, not just modern, but even a PC from 20 years ago could run this game at a really high resolution. You could even add custom resolutions uh, in in the command line in the command console to to have 1080p resolutions, which is great. You can also enable transparent water. You can enable a whole bunch of these really cool effects. You can even add, if you have a certain version of Quake, you can even add smooth animation. You see that the the enemies, they kind of move a bit jittery and stuff, and that's because originally there wasn't some kind of interpolation or tweening of animations. That would be introduced a little bit later. However, it would be introduced in the form of a version of Quake that would be released by a fan, not by id Software. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. id Software, they had to release a separate executable, or in other words, the technical term would be a source port, officially released by id Software, called GL Quake, which stands for OpenGL for Quake. And OpenGL is, of course, the graphics API that communicates directly with the graphics card. So if the game is running through the API, then it's taking advantage of your GPU. And and that's how everything is done nowadays. But that back then, it was a very new technology. And 3D effects, they started the whole craze, the 3D craze, but we got a whole bunch of different companies, including ATI, which would eventually become part of AMD, and NVIDIA, which they would release their graphics cards to compete with the Voodoo line of graphics cards. And now, of course, 3D effects went under just due to bad marketing or just technology not catching up. I like this part where it looks like I'm going to die, but I managed to kill him just in time. The door closed behind me because I had no way of getting out of that situation. I guess I could have circle strafed around him, but there was lava, and this game is very slippery. The physics is a lot slippery in this game than it is in Doom. But yeah, so that's what we had to deal with. Now we don't have to use original GL Quake to use 3D accelerated graphics. We can just use other source ports that run better in Windows 10. Trying to get some of these old programs to work in Windows 10 is actually quite difficult. WinQuake, believe it or not, up to very recently could still work on Windows 10, which is crazy. But then I wanted to record with WinQuake for the software renderer, and it just didn't work. and that's when I realized that, what, I think it's finally happening. The software is starting to become obsolete, as in, I mean, it is obsolete, but as in, like, we can't get it to run anymore. I tried everything. WinQuake doesn't work anymore. Either Microsoft did something, one of their recent updates, maybe NVIDIA. I use a NVIDIA GeForce graphics card, so maybe it's that. But anyways, so fortunately we have other source ports, so we don't have to rely on id Software's official source ports like WinQuake and GL Quake. So this source port is one of the more popular ones. This is Dark Places. Now, you might notice that the frame rate seems a little jittery. There's a reason for that. Dark Places is able to enhance the graphics, as you can plainly see, but it's a very, very inefficient way of doing it. I'm basically just maxing out all of the graphical effects, and the engine is just sort of trying to do the best it can, try to guess where the shadows should be, where the lighting should be, and it just ends up just being very inefficient because it's kind of like it's over complicated, or it's over engineered. Now, that's not the engine's fault. That's not Dark Place's fault. You just need to, create a file that tells the engine where the lighting needs to be and all of that stuff. Because all that the engine has to go on is all the individual models and elements that produce light. And that's not a very effective way of doing it. Now, bear in mind, this PC that I was capturing this recording this video off of, is capable of running Doom Eternal at ultra high settings. And the game doesn't even drop even 1 frame below 60 frames per second. So that shows you just how incredibly inefficient this is of doing it. Now, here on the other hand, this is me actually adding some features to help direct the power of the Dark Places source port. And you might also notice that I've also added some high-res textures. And as you can see, the lighting not only looks better, but the game is also now running silky smooth. Of course, I'm recording this at 30 frames per second, but playing this normally, in fact, even on my 10-year-old PC, this game runs perfectly smooth. Max HD resolution, 60 FPS, all of that stuff. So Dark Places can be very efficient, but the kind of lighting that I used was, I forget what it's called. I think the lighting mod that I'm using, I think is called Perfected Lighting or Perfect Lighting, something like that. I tried to look for it again online. I don't remember where I downloaded it, and unfortunately I wasn't able to find it. However, there are many different mods that you can download to restructure the lighting so that you'll get a far more efficient way of the engine handling lighting, and you'll get way better performance. And it's kind of a requirement, unless you turn off all of the enhancements of Dark Places. But at that point, you're kind of, missing the point of Dark Places. Like, if you're gonna play vanilla Quake, with vanilla graphics, it'd be better to just use something like FitzQuake or ProQuake. But I think that the single player aspect of Quake is by far one of the more memorable stuff about Quake nowadays. The multiplayer was revolutionary at the time, but the single player campaign, on the other hand, like, we haven't really gotten other games like this. Quake 2 was nothing like this. It was actually not supposed to be a sequel to Quake 1. And even though we kind of got this sort of tone with Doom 3, make no mistake, Quake 1 is still a much more action-oriented shooter, as opposed to Doom 3 being more slow-paced, which isn't bad. I don't dislike Doom 3. I think that some of my most favorite first-person shooters all come from id Software, and that's no coincidence. A lot of the design philosophies of id Software carried over to modern id, even though the original team that worked on these games, except for Kevin Cloud, he's still with the company. I actually spoke to him through email because he was helping me release for the official Unity release of Doom 0. That was like really cool. I get to speak to one of the guys that worked on Doom and Quake. But I think that the single play is this really, really nice balance between something that is just high octane action and very creepy ambient driven type of experience. But we still have not gotten a single player game in the same style as Quake 1, and I hope that sometime in the future we will get a game like that. So thank you for all joining me in celebration of Quake, and I hope that you've maybe got something out of it, maybe some insight, idea what it was like playing this game back in the 90s. But thank you very much for listening. Take care.